Good morning. I want to talk about something very mathematical today. I want to talk about patterns in a sequence of numbers known as the Fibonacci sequence, patterns within that sequence that reflect or mirror patterns within elements of traditional astrology. And this is really important because, one, there are just so many patterns in the Fibonacci sequence that correspond to patterns in astrology. But it's important because if astrology were just nonsense, just nothing more than a lot of random noise, then you wouldn't expect to find any patterns whatsoever. The fact that there are patterns between the Fibonacci sequence and astrology shows that there is a structure to astrology, which is not just random, which is not just nonsense. Now, it's well known that patterns in the Fibonacci sequence also tend to be found within nature. Okay. And the fact that you also find patterns within astrology, between astrology and the Fibonacci sequences, is kind of strongly suggesting that astrology too is a real part of nature. It's part of the way the world is constructed. And that construction, again, is reflected in the Fibonacci sequence. So let me see if I can share my screen and we'll get started. I have to get rid of a few panels so that I can see what I'm doing here. So just bear with me a few more seconds. Almost there. And we're ready to go. I've titled this presentation, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Fibonacci Numbers in Astrology and the Natural Sciences. And this title is based on a very famous paper published back in 1960 by physicist Eugene Wigner that was titled The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics and the Natural Sciences. And the conclusion of that paper was that once you get a good mathematical model for physics, then anything which is true within the mathematics also tends to be true within the physical world. And I think something similar is happening here between Fibonacci numbers and astrology. There's so many interesting patterns between the two that I suspect that any pattern you find within the Fibonacci numbers will eventually be found to have relevance and application to astrology. Okay, now this presentation explores patterns in the Fibonacci sequence that reflect patterns found in astrology. And the presence of such patterns suggests astrology is not a random collection of nonsense. Instead, since Fibonacci patterns are found throughout nature, the results presented here suggest that astrology too is a part of nature. A few of the observations I'll make are discoveries of my own, but most were discovered by others and are presented here with occasional modifications from me. Also, some of the people who have been working in this field are Russell Olhausen, Raphael Gilbrand, Santino Mancuso, also known as David Cochran, Linda Berry, and me, Christopher Benton. It's a small group, but this is research that can change the world. Also, at the very end of this slideshow, I'll have a couple of slides listing videos by Santino that can be found on YouTube, which go into many of the things I talk about here in more detail and talk about some other things too. Okay, now in 1170 of the Common Era, about 1,000 years ago almost, a man named Leonardo was born in Italy in the Republic of Pisa. He grew up to become one of the greatest mathematicians of the Middle Ages, and today he is known simply as Fibonacci, the son of Bonacci. He introduced algebra and Arabic numerals to Europeans, and he is very famous for the following problem that gives rise to what today we call the Fibonacci sequence. So here's the problem. A man put a male-female pair of newly born rabbits in a field. Rabbits take a month to mature before mating. 1 month after mating, females give birth to one male-female pair and then mate again. And every month thereafter, they give birth to another male-female pair. Also, these rabbits are immortal. No rabbits ever die. And the question is, how many rabbit pairs are there after 1 year, or actually at any moment in time? Well, we can analyze the problem this way. We'll let a couple of small letter r's represent the baby rabbits, and capital letter r's represent the adult rabbits. So we start out in the first month with a pair of baby rabbits, one male, one female. It takes them a month to mature, so a month later we got two adult rabbits, but still just one pair. However, after this month, we still have the original pair, but they give birth to a new pair of baby rabbits, one male, one female. So in this month, we got two pairs of rabbits. In the next month, we still have the original pair. They give birth to yet another pair of male female rabbits. And this pair of babies, they mature to adulthood. So at this point, we got three pairs of rabbits. You can just keep going on and on like this. And on the side here, we're generating what we call the Fibonacci sequence. Okay, now, once we get past these first two terms, mathematically speaking, you generate additional terms of the Fibonacci sequence just by adding the previous two. So 1 plus 1 is 2, 1 plus 2 is 3, 2 plus 3 is 5. If we go down here to continue, 3 plus 5 is 8, 5 plus 8 is 13, 8 plus 13 is 21, and on it goes. Okay. These days, many people begin the Fibonacci sequence with 0 instead of 1, and we will do that too once we begin looking at Paisano periods. Thus, in most of our examples, the Fibonacci sequence will begin with 0, but in our first example, it will begin with 1. However, in both cases, once we get beyond the second term, the n plus 1 term is always the sum of the previous two, and we express this by writing a sub n minus 1 plus a sub n is equal to a sub n plus 1. Okay. If we begin our sequence with 1 and look at the sequence of ratios of consecutive terms, then these ratios get closer and closer to an irrational number known as the golden ratio. This number, which is approximately 1.618034, has long been considered the most pleasing ratio to look at. Consequently, its use is found in both architecture and art. Examples of both the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio are also found throughout nature. So here we generate a second sequence by just taking ratios of successive terms. So we got 1 over 1, 2 over 1, 3 over 2, 5 over 3, 8 over 5. And these ratios get closer and closer to 1 plus square root of 5 over 2, which is the exact value of the golden ratio. Okay, here's a couple of examples of the Fibonacci sequence in nature. When it comes to trees, we often find this pattern. We start with the trunk, which doesn't branch, but then we finally get a branch, so we got two branches. One of these branches again, you get three branches. We get some more branching, 5, 8, 13. And you can see that branching based on this Fibonacci pattern looks very much like what we see in many trees. Now, if we look at the ancestry tree, a different kind of tree, the ancestry tree for a male bee, a male bee is produced by an unfertilized egg, so it has just one parent, the female or the queen bee. The queen, however, comes from a fertilized egg, so she has two parents, one male and one female. So we can start with the male bee. It has one parent, a female. That female has two parents. Go back another generation. The male parent has just one parent itself. The female has two parents again. And if you start counting up the number of bees in each generation, you're getting back the Fibonacci sequence. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and so on. So in the next generation following this one, there would be 5 plus 8, or 13 bees. Okay, I'll pause for a second, take a sip of my tea. All right. Now, if you construct a rectangle so that the ratio of the longer side to the shorter side is the golden ratio, we call that a golden rectangle. If you cut a square out of a golden rectangle, what you're left with will be a smaller golden rectangle. You can cut a square out of that one, and you're left with an even smaller golden rectangle. And you can repeat this procedure over and over. When you do so, you're going to get a spiral that fits through opposite corners of your squares, and we'll call this a golden spiral. And we tend to see this spiral throughout nature. We see it in the shapes of spiral galaxies. We see it in the shape of seashells over here. It's found in sunflowers, for example, where we have golden spirals going this way and also golden spirals going out this way. And various parts of the human body also appear to be in a ratio that relates to the golden ratio. Okay. And the golden ratio is also found a lot in art because it's considered the most pleasing ratio to look at. So people see it within the painting The Mona Lisa, this famous Japanese painting known as the Wave, and also in the Greek Parthenon. I have a little caveat here, a little note. Not all mathematicians support every claim of the Fibonacci sequence occurring in nature or art. Uh, some people, for instance, some mathematicians would look at the wave and this golden spiral here and say, well, yes, kind of, it's close to that, but it's not exact, no cigar. Others would look at it and say, oh, yes, well, it's maybe not 100% exact, but it's close enough for government work. So sometimes, even among mathematicians, whether a work of art is an example of the golden ratio or not, the Fibonacci sequence or not, that can be a matter of debate. Nonetheless, the sequence is so important in mathematics that there's long been a journal, the Fibonacci Quarterly, devoted to new discoveries. Now, two things need to be explained before we can be looking at the links between the Fibonacci sequence and astrology. The first is modular arithmetic, and the second is what a Paisano period is. Modular arithmetic is what many people know as clock arithmetic. It's a form of arithmetic that can turn an infinite sequence into a repeating cycle. And it does this by starting over once a certain threshold is reached. More specifically, if we want to find the value of some number modulo n, then we simply find the remainder after dividing our number by n. Thus, 17 modulo 10 is 7, because that's the remainder when you divide by 7. I'm sorry, divide by 10. 17 modulo 9 is 8. Divide 17 by 9, you get a remainder of 8. And 17 modulo 5 is 2. So the numbers 7, 8, and 2 are the respective remainders when we divide 17 in turn by 10, 9, and 15. Now again, this is just like clock arithmetic. In clock arithmetic, we start over again once we get to 12. In the integers modulo 12, we would replace 12 by 0. But for example, we don't look at a clock and say it's 15 o'clock. Instead, we subtract or we divide 15 by 12. We get a remainder of 3. And we say, no, we started over. It's 3 o'clock. Okay, if you begin with the Fibonacci sequence, and if for some natural number n, you find the value of each number modulo n, they can be shown that this procedure will always produce a finite sequence of values that repeats indefinitely. The length of this sequence is called the Paisano period of n, and we will be particularly interested in the Paisano periods and sequences for the values 5, 9, 10, and 81. Furthermore, for convenience, I'll use the term Paisano period to refer not only to the length of the finite sequence produced, but also to the elements of that sequence in the order that they occur. Thus, Paisano 2 will be used by us to refer to both the length 3 of the sequence 0, 1, 1 and to the sequence itself. And for reference, on the left is a table for the Paisano periods for the numbers from 1 to 144. And from this table, we can see that the Paisano period for 5 is 20, that's 24 for 9, 60 for 10, 216 for 81. That's 72 plus 9 here is 81. Okay, and you can see just looking at the first 144 Paisano periods, we have an infinite number of Paisano periods. But looking at just the first 144, there's an awful lot out here that we are not looking at today, that we are not exploring. But presumably, each of these Paisano periods could reveal patterns that are relevant also to astrology. Okay, the planet ladder, the Fibonacci sequence and planetary rulerships. Let me have another sip of water real quick, or tea. Okay, now the planet ladder, it's an ancient diagram that explains the ancient planetary rulerships of signs. It's often drawn with Taurus rising, and you can see how the symmetry is used to explain why Mercury rules both Gemini and Virgo, Venus rules both Taurus and Libra, Mars rules both Aries and Scorpio, Jupiter rules both Pisces and Sagittarius, and Saturn rules both Aquarius and Capricorn. So if we look at this, we got Cancer and Leo down here. They correspond to the Sun and the Moon. So these are the two planets that have to do with our conscious awareness. And then if we go out one sign in each direction, we have Gemini and Virgo. They're both ruled by Mercury. The next two signs are Taurus and Libra, both ruled by Venus. Next, we get Aries and Scorpio, both ruled by Mars. And then we have Pisces and Sagittarius, both ruled in ancient times by Jupiter. Then we have Aquarius and Capricorn, both ruled by Saturn. These are before the discovery of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Okay, so long ago, the symmetry that you see in this diagram was used to explain why planetary rulerships are the way they are. Now, the planet ladder is also sometimes drawn with Scorpio rising and the sun and the moon at the top. And I see this as an arrangement for the creation of the universe. And Scorpio represents the powerful energies of the Big Bang. Sagittarius symbolizes an expanding universe. And Capricorn signifies the crystallization of energy into matter. In contrast, Aries rising may represent the birth of something in a universe that already exists. Now, I'll mention this later. If we have a zodiac that begins with Aries, I'll call that an Aries zodiac. But if we're starting our zodiac with Scorpio, and then going around Scorpio, Sagittarius, Leo, and so on, I'm going to call that a Scorpio zodiac. And the Scorpio zodiac symbolically seems to explain the creation of the universe. Scorpio is ruled by Pluto, that's death and transformation, rebirth, the phoenix rising out of the ashes, and that seems to correspond quite well to the Big Bang. Sagittarius ruled by Jupiter, it has to do with expansion, so after the Big Bang, and even now we have an expanding universe. Capricorn ruled by Saturn, that represents the crystallization of uh, atomic particles. And Aquarius, which has to do with group activity. This refers to some of those particles coming together with one another. Then we get to Pisces, which doesn't have well-defined boundaries. This can represent the giant gas clouds that start to form. And then we get to Aries. Those gas clouds start to give birth to stars. And the universe as we know it, as we experience it, begins to come into existence. Following this, you have larger forms of matter coalescing, planets being formed. That's Taurus. Then Gemini, you have interactions, communications of sorts between these structures. Finally, we get to Cancer. Homes are being created. Solar systems and galaxies are being created. And anyway, we can just keep going around and we find more and more associations. We get uh, with these completed homes, there's now more of a sense of identity for each structure, represented by Leo. The details are being filled in. And then the final product is this completed universe where everything stands in a certain relationship to everything else. And I would argue that our physical world, it's really all about relationships, whether it's relationship of Earth to the sun or the relationship of one person to another. All these separate things wind up being created, creating a world of separation, if you will. But then, because of that separation, everything seeks to understand its relationship with everything else. Okay, so that's the story of creation told by a Scorpio zodiac, the zodiac that begins with Scorpio. And now we'll start with the plant ladder that's shown over here with Scorpio rising. So we got in ancient times, Scorpio ruled by Mars, Sagittarius by Jupiter, Capricorn by Saturn, Aquarius also by Saturn, Pisces by Jupiter, and so on around the wheel. Okay, next we write the first 24 elements in the Fibonacci sequence, starting with 1 in Virgo. This is going to be Virgo here, and proceeding clockwise. Additionally, we'll assign 2 numbers in the Fibonacci sequence to each sign. Why do we do this? Well, primarily just because it works. But we can also see this as a reminder that succeeding terms in the Fibonacci sequence are generally the sum of the previous 2. Okay, time for another sip of tea. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is within each sign, we're going to add each of these 2 numbers together. So Next step is to add the two numbers placed in each sign together. Thus, for Virgo, 1 plus 1 equals 2. For Libra, 2 plus 3 is 5. For Scorpio, 5 plus 8 is 13, and so on and so forth. And finally, we rewrite each number modulo 9. So we take each of these numbers, look to see what the remainder will be when we divide by 9. 9 goes into 5 0 times with remainder 5, so this number is unchanged. 9 goes into 13 one time with remainder 4, so that one, yeah, it's going to change. Okay, for another example, the number for Capricorn was 89, and this number, modulo 9, is 8. So we get an 8 for Capricorn. Likewise, 233, the number for Aquarius, is equal to 8 modulo 9. 8 is the remainder when you divide 233 by 9. And finally, if we look at the symmetry of the numbers around our wheel, it mirrors the symmetry of the plant ladder, and this is the first of several patterns we'll find between astrology and the Fibonacci sequence. So this is really interesting. Since sun and moon are both connected with perception, they are both represented by 1. Mercury, in each instance, is represented by 2. Venus by 5. Mars by 4 here, 4 here. Jupiter by 7 here, 7 here. Saturn by 8 and by 8. So you get the exact same symmetry, but the numerical symmetry is coming from the Fibonacci sequence. The astrological symmetry comes just from astrology, but you can readily see how these two symmetries are identical. Now, interestingly, the planetary numbers found for this planet ladder seem to also correspond to their interpretations in vibrational astrology, which is a particular form of harmonic astrology. For example, the one harmonic represents conjunction or union, and the sun and moon represent the use of our conscious awareness that connects us with everything in the universe. The number 2, Mercury, corresponds to overcoming oppositions, and Mercury helps us reconcile opposites through logical thinking and communication. The number 4 represents squares and struggles, and that certainly conforms to the planet Mars in astrology. The number 5, which represents Venus, corresponds to quintiles, and that feeling of playfulness, joy, and euphoria, such as after a successful first date. Also, the diagram on the left shows how the geocentric longitude of Venus varies over time as Venus orbits the Sun. And this diagram defines a 5-pointed star and pentagon. Additionally, if you take the ratio of any long side to the next longest side, the pentagram, so you can kind of complete a 5-pointed star here, then that ratio will always be the golden ratio. So, the number 5, its meaning in vibrational astrology corresponds pretty well to Venus, but it also, we find that 5 in this pattern generated by the orbit of Venus. And within that pattern, a 5-point star, you also find the golden ratio. Interesting. Now, the number 7 for Jupiter here, it corresponds to septiles and the kind of focus one has before a first date. And with Jupiter involved, this suggests the possibility of larger reality coming into view if that date is successful. Right. When we are about to go on that first date, well, this other person, they may be the one. And if they are the one, our world is going to expand dramatically. And that kind of expansion is what Jupiter is. Okay, and lastly, the number 8 for Saturn, it represents semi-squares and the need to build. And Saturn, of course, is the master builder among the planets. So it's interestingly that we can tell stories about these numbers. We can use basic meanings from vibrational astrology for the harmonic angles represented by these numbers, and they seem to fit well with the actual planets here in the planet ladder. Okay, now after I have another sip of tea, we'll talk about the zodiac, the Fibonacci sequence in 12 signs. Yeah. Now, many of our subsequent calculations will be done modulo 10, and the Paisano period for 10 is 60. Thus, on the left are the first 60 terms of the Fibonacci sequence. If we begin our sequence with 0, and we'll also let 0 correspond to 0 degrees Aries. So if we're starting at 0 degrees Aries, we're using an Aries zodiac here. All right, we next rewrite each Fibonacci number modulo 10, and notice that the numbers 0 and 5 occur exactly 12 times and are equally spaced, thus corresponding to the 12 astrological signs. So we got 60 numbers. That's going to give us 5 numbers in each sign. Starting with Aries, the sequence begins 0, 1, 1, 2, 3. Then Taurus begins 5, 3, 3, 1, 4. Gemini 5, 9, 4, 3, 7. And we just go counterclockwise around the zodiac till we're done. And you can see the numbers 0 and 5, they occur only at the beginning of astrological signs. Additionally, all the cardinal signs start with 0, and this suggests the specialness that these signs hold within astrology. Okay, furthermore, each sequence of 5 numbers from the table on the previous slide can be considered as a 5-digit code for the corresponding sign. There are other sequences besides Paisano 10 that contain a pattern of 12, but we'll stick with Paisano 10 since it is also the source of several other patterns that are found in astrology. And let's see. Yeah. Next is the elements, the Fibonacci sequence, and fire, earth, air, and water. Okay. To find a pattern that mimics the 4 elements in astrology, we'll begin with our 5-digit modulo 10 codes for Aries through Pisces that we present at the end of the last section. And here I've got that same table right up here. Next, we'll group our 5-digit modulo 10 codes by element. So we put all the fire codes, fire signs together, all the earth codes and signs together, air codes and signs together, water codes and signs together. And finally, we rewrite each code modulo 5. And when we do so, we discover that within each element, the codes for the signs become the same. So once I take these numbers, convert each one modulo 5. So here that would be 0, 1, 1, 2, and the remainder of 3, why divide by 5? And that's what you get here, 0, 1, 1, 2, 3. Well, at this point, all the fire signs have the same 5-digit code. All the earth signs have the same 5-digit code. All the air signs have the same 5-digit code. And all the water signs have the same 5-digit code. So we're finding that pattern of fire, earth, air, and water within patterns generated by the Fibonacci sequence. In particular, we took the Fibonacci sequence, found patterns modulo 10, and then we reduced those to modulo 5. Now we can do a similar analysis by pairing our 5-digit modulo 10 codes with the zodiac that begins in Scorpio instead of Aries. In this respect, I think of the Scorpio zodiac as representing the zodiac for the creation of the universe. And I've already gone over how that Scorpio zodiac symbolizes quite well the Big Bang and what followed. But contrast to the Scorpio zodiac, I interpret the Aries zodiac as referring to new beginnings in an already existing universe. Okay, so here I've got my 60 Paisano 10 numbers, but I lay them on the zodiac beginning with Scorpio rather than Aries. And in the Scorpio zodiac, our 5-digit modulo 10 codes for the signs of each element are given in this table on the left. Well, next, we're going to reduce everything modulo 5 once more. And the same thing happens. We get the same 5-digit codes for water, same 5-digit codes for fire, same 5-digit codes for earth, and the same 5-digit codes for air. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this code for water, 01123. I'm just going to add these numbers together, express the result modulo 10, and I get 7. And I'll do the same for fire. I'll take the 5-digit code 03314, add up those numbers. That adds up to 11. But modulo 10, the result is 1. And likewise, we get the earth number is 3, the air number is 5. So I kind of think of these numbers as representing sort of the primordial meaning of water, fire, earth, and air. It's kind of interesting that starts with water. It's interesting from a biblical sense, where in the creation of the universe, Genesis talks about separating the upper waters from the lower waters. So that's interesting. We can also find meaning in these numbers. We can relate these elements to the meanings of these numbers in vibrational astrology. For example, the 7 harmonic aspect, you divide 360 degrees by 7 to get that aspect. It's approximately 51 degrees. That gives us the aspect we call a septile. And in vibrational astrology, the septile is all about focus. And I would say that we focus on things emotionally, not intellectually with our left brain. Our left brain is, it's just thoughts, just words about this or that. But focusing on something, that is an emotional connection, intensity that we make with that something. So water tends to be about feelings and emotions. The 7 vibration, we could say, also has this emotional component because that's what we need to focus on something. We need that emotional attachment. Fire is about beginnings. It refers to one uh, vibrationally, and this is, it's like the sign Aries. This is a newborn baby, something just beginning. And at the start, it knows only just oneness. It hasn't separated the world into this or that yet. So whenever something is beginning, there is only oneness, not the experience of separation yet, and that sense of being one with everything. Earth is associated with the number 3. The 3rd harmonic angle is 120 degrees, which is a trine. Trines represent stability, not just ease or harmony, but also stability. And physical Earth is also a symbol for stability. And lastly, in harmonic astrology, the number 9, the root 9th harmonic angle, which is the novile, 40 degrees, 360 degrees divided by 9. The novile has to do with connection with the community, and air is traditionally communication, which helps us connect with others in our world and in our community. Okay, so remember these numbers over here because we're going to use them pretty soon. In fact, I say here we'll use these numbers next to find a pattern for the three modes, cardinal, fixed, and mutable. Okay, let's take a look at these modes. And I need another sip of tea real quick. This is going to be very, very interesting. The Fibonacci pattern for the three modes, cardinal, fixed, and mutable. This pattern involves both the Aries zodiac and the Scorpio zodiac. And it's also going to involve those numerical codes for water, fire, earth, and air that I just showed you. So we'll begin with the 5-digit codes modulo 10 for the Aries zodiac, grouped by element. Okay, we've seen this table before. Next, we regroup these signs and codes by mode instead of elements. So we put the signs and codes for the codes for the cardinal signs together, the codes for the fixed signs together, the codes for the mutable signs together. However, remember what we found earlier as a single-digit number for each element using the Scorpio zodiac. Specifically, we found that water is 7, fire is 1, earth is 3, air is 9. Again, notice that our codes for the modes over here are found with respect to the Aries zodiac, while the numbers for the elements over here are found using the Scorpio zodiac. Okay, for the cardinal signs, we start with the 5-digit code for Aries. We're always going to start with the code for fire. And we multiply it by the fire number, which is 1. And we reduce the result modulo 10. Well, you take this for the cardinal fire, you take the code for Aries, multiply it by 1, modulo 10, you get back the same thing. But look at what happens if I multiply this Aries code by 7. 7 is going to be the water number. You multiply this by 7, reduce it modulo 10, you get back the code for Cancer. Okay, this is the 5-digit code in our Aries zodiac for Cancer. When you take modulo 10 of the Fibonacci sequence, you get that Paisano period of length 60. You lay it around the zodiac beginning at Aries. And this is the 5-digit code that falls within Cancer. So I multiplied the fire code, the Aries code, by the number for water, I get back the water sign. You multiply this code by the number for air, and you get back the code for Libra, which is an air sign. You multiply the fire code by the number down here for Earth, you get back the 5-digit Earth code for Capricorn. That is amazing. And the same thing is going to happen also with fixed and mutable numbers. If I take in fixed, I start with the code for fire. If you multiply that fire code by 1, the number for fire, you get back the same thing. But if you multiply uh, the fire code by 3, 3 is the number for Earth, you get back the code for fixed Earth, which is Taurus. And likewise with mutable signs. You take, let's see, the code for that mutable fire, which is the code for Sagittarius, multiply it by 9 for air, and you get back the code for mutable air, which is Gemini. And this is a very strong connection between the Fibonacci sequence and both the Aries zodiac and the Scorpio zodiac. And it's really just extraordinary. Okay, now the Fibonacci sequence can also distinguish between masculine and feminine signs, which are also known as positive and negative signs. And what we'll do is, let's see, we begin with 5-digit modulo 5 codes for the Aries zodiac. So using the Aries zodiac and those modulo 5 codes, these are the codes for fire, codes for earth, codes for air, codes for water. Next, observe that if you multiply each of the numbers in the code for air by 4 and then express the result modulo 5, you get the code for fire. So code for air, for all the air signs, it's 04432. Multiply that number up here by 4, we get 0, 16, 16, 12, and 8. Reduce those numbers modulo 5. Look at the remainder you get when you divide by 5. Well, let's see if we have 16. 5 goes into 16 3 times to get 15. 16 minus 15, that leaves a remainder of 1. And so when we look at those remainders modulo 5, we're getting back 0, 1, 1, 2, 3. That is that reduced modulo 5 code for the fire signs. So multiplying air by 4, reducing it modulo 5, that gives you the fire code. Likewise, if you start with the fire code, multiply it by 4, reduce the result modulo 5, you get back that 5-digit code for air. So this shows a connection between fire and air where you can use the same procedure to go back and forth from one to another. And in astrology, we call that connection being a positive sign or a masculine sign. And we think of the masculine or positive signs as the energy is more outgoing, it's directed outward. Now, the same thing happens with earth and water signs. We take our 5-digit code, modulo 5, and let's see, these, I think I said that we got these codes, yeah, using the Aries zodiac. Oops, go back one. We could take this Aries zodiac 5-digit code for water, 02241, multiply it by 4, reduce the result modulo 5, I get back the 5-digit code for earth signs. Likewise, take the 5-digit code for earth signs, 03314, multiply each of those numbers by 4, reduce them modulo 5, so 4 times 3 is 12. The remainder after dividing by 5 is 2. Okay, and do that for each number, and you get back the code for water. So this is a procedure which switches back and forth between water and earth signs. And that's how we see the Fibonacci sequence identifying this pattern in astrology that we call negative or feminine signs. And the energy of feminine signs in astrology is directed more inward, whereas the positive signs, the energy tends to go more outward. Okay, the last section here is on the nakshatras, the Fibonacci sequence, and Vedic astrology. And in Vedic astrology, the zodiac is divided into 27 lunar mansions called nakshatras. And this division is based on the 27-day length of the sidereal month. And each nakshatra is further divided into 4 sections called padas. And this results in a division of the zodiac into 108 padas. And each sign of the zodiac is comprised of 9 padas. Each nakshatra has 4 padas. And 108, by the way, is a holy number in Hinduism. A lot of things in that religion happen in numbers divisions of 108. Okay. Again, another sip of tea. We will find a pattern related to these subdivisions if we construct Paisano 81. This Paisano period has a cycle of 216 elements that repeat, and so we do the following. We put two consecutive numbers of Paisano 81 in each pada, beginning with 0 degrees Aries, so using an Aries zodiac. Add the two numbers in each pada together to reduce the period to 108. Interesting, we used a similar kind of procedure when we were looking at the plant ladder. And then we're going to express all the results modulo 3 of all things. Now, if we look at the results for the first 6 nakshatras, the patterns are already very clear. Each nakshatra is coded by the sequence 1020. Get the same sequence for each nakshatra. Furthermore, within each nakshatra, the first pada is always 1, the second pada is always 0, the third pada is always 2, and the fourth pada is always 0. Now, there are 9 padas in each zodiac sign. If we display our modulo 3 padas in groups of 9, then we get a numeric pattern that repeats every 4 signs. So I've got the pattern here for the 4 signs Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer. When we go on to Leo, you're going to repeat the same pattern for the next 4 signs. So additionally, we have a different sequence for each of the elements, fire, earth, air, and water. So this is another identification of the elements within the Fibonacci sequence. And so these 9-digit codes also distinguish between the elements. Furthermore, if for each sign we take the sum of the modulo 3 padas, just add these guys up, and then display the sum modulo 3, we get back the same sequence 1020 that occurs in each nakshatra. This suggests that the 4 padas in each nakshatra are related to the 4 elements of fire, earth, air, and water. And finally, we note that the above sums, modulo 3 or 0 for feminine signs, and non-zero for the masculine signs. So for instance, Taurus and Cancer, the sum modulo 3 was 0. For Aries and Gemini, the sum modulo 3 was not 0. So we've got within analysis of these nakshatras, we find not only this connection between the Fibonacci sequence and the padas and nakshatras, we also find more patterns for the 4 elements and also a pattern that distinguishes between positive signs and negative signs. Very, very interesting. So, in summary, I've presented in this slideshow just a few of the important patterns contained within Paisano periods that are mirrored by astrological features such as the elements and modes of zodiac signs, as well as other phenomena like the nakshatras of Vedic astrology. There are an enormous number of patterns in the Fibonacci sequence, and I've extracted out of this enormous number just a few of the more salient ones that are related to the basics of traditional astrology. As we've seen, many of these patterns exist within Paisano 10, but other Paisano periods also appear to be important too. And I suspect that will eventually be shown that every pattern in the Fibonacci sequence has relevance to some connection between celestial and terrestrial events. A few conclusions. Critics might say that all I've done is akin to looking at clouds in order to identify random images that occur. However, I would reply that nothing is further from the truth. For one thing, I already know what astrological elements I want to find patterns for. Thus, this is more like looking at clouds expecting to find not only a detailed image of your house, but also images of every single room inside your house. That is not so easy to do when looking at clouds. Furthermore, not every Paisano period yields the kind of patterns we're looking for. And so it's not the case that we can simply pick any Paisano period at random and discover patterns related to traditional astrology. In other words, it's unlikely that the patterns we're seeing are simply chance occurrences. Instead, they are patterns that reflect the basics of astrology. And consequently, they tell us that astrology has a structure that is similar to that found within the sequence of Fibonacci numbers. Now, a question that has to be asked, though, is not only why do Fibonacci patterns appear in astrology, but also why do Fibonacci patterns appear throughout nature? The answer appears to be unknown, but I would point out that just as the Fibonacci sequence is determined by the recursive relation a sub n minus 1 plus a sub n equal a sub n plus 1, so might we think of reality as being defined by a similar recursive relation, namely past plus present equal future. This formula has essentially the same structure as this one, and I think that's why we see the Fibonacci sequence mirrored in both physical reality and in astrology. Now, a lot more dots will have to be connected to verify that this is why Fibonacci patterns occur in both nature and astrology, but this looks like a good starting point. And one last point I would make is that just as patterns that appear, just as any pattern that appears in a mathematical model for physics tends to have relevance for the physical world, so do I suspect that any pattern in the Fibonacci sequence will also signify some application to astrology. In other words, the adventure has just begun. Okay, now the very last thing I have here are a series of videos by Santino Mancuso on YouTube. If you go to YouTube, you can either search for the YouTube channel Cosmic Cybernetics and Cosmobiology, or you can search by the name of a particular video. Once you get to this YouTube site, you can search within that site also for the names of these videos. But a lot of what I initially knew about all this topic came from these videos by Santino, and he's done a lot of them. And so I've got 4 here and 5 more over here. So these are well worth watching. Okay, that is going to be the end. So let me stop sharing and let me get myself in focus again. Wow, I'm so out of focus. Hold on a second here. Let's see if I can fix that. There, I'm not so fuzzy-headed anymore. Just having a Neptune moment there. My boundaries were getting very blurry. But anyway, this has been a long video. You might have to listen to it in parts, just one segment at a time. But this, and also those videos by Santino, they're all very important. This is a very important connection between astrology, mathematics, and the natural world, uh, which not a lot of people, either within astrology or outside of astrology, have paid attention to. But trust me when I say this is extremely important stuff. Uh, these connections mean something. And these connections show that astrology uh, is not just nonsense. It has a structure to it. And it's similar to the structure found throughout nature. And that suggests that astrology, too, is a natural science. Okay, well, as I said, for those of us doing work in this area, the adventure continues, and I hope you become one of those adventurers in the future. And I also hope you enjoyed this somewhat lengthy video. But for now, I'll just say so long and be well.